but we are here, and that's great. And I want to just say that we will give you, let's say, half an hour maximum for your presentation, and then we will follow another 25 minutes Q&A, which I will coordinate, because in the last 5 minutes I will invite Frank to give you a fantastic news. It is him to give it to you, although I know, and I'm so happy. You will be absolutely astonished by this news, which is about AutoBest, by the way. Talking about Peter, I will tell you a few things. You all know Peter. He is a real legend of the design of the car industry. It happened to me to be so lucky in my life to be a friend of Peter since early ages. Somehow we connected. We discovered we see many things in the same way. And I was that guy trying to always be close to him, influence him somehow for a better. I remember sometimes we've been forced to go in toilets to talk because we never know who is listening. But that's a long time ago. I'm happy that his life was so fulfilling because he did many things for many brands. Today, as we discussed together in our meeting, he is running probably the biggest design office in the car industry with so many new models and brands under his overall supervision. And even if he's not nowadays leading Volvo, Volvo as a brand is owing him a lot about the things which was him doing back then. But of course he will talk more about the present. And of course I was pushing him to tell us a little bit more about Terrafugia flying cars because we are all excited about that. So thank you very much once again.
Thanks, Dan. Right, well, what I thought I'd talk to you, in fact, what I was asked to talk about was how we manage this, what is obviously a transition period between our traditional combustion engine cars into a future which will be more and more electric. And what does that do when it comes to design? How does that affect our work? That and autonomous, of course, is what we're told is the future. So in order to sort of explain where we're going, I thought I'd go right back into history. Now, some of you may have seen parts of this presentation as it was when I was at Volvo, please bear with me because I hope it will make some sort of sense. You'll see where we're going and how we see the future of automobiles. But to start with, let's see if I get this right. Yeah. This is more or less where we started. The familiar layout of the horse, the driver, and the passenger. And that is precisely what we knew back then. And when the first cars appeared, all that was missing was the horse. And look at this. This is an electric car. And the layout of it is quite unique. But for the people back then, there was something missing. It looks like we're waiting for the team of horses to turn up. So that's what they did. They abandoned that, and they put the horses back where they should be. In other words, the power pulling the carriage is where it should be. And this was much more familiar to people. So this is how it developed. And of course, the more money you had, the more horses you could afford. And as with a team of 4 or 6 or 8 horses, the power unit just got longer and the people stayed sitting over the rear axle, just like in the carriage. Then you got to fairly extreme lengths eventually, as with this Bugatti. You can see even the shape of this is really a horse-drawn carriage, and the poor driver is sitting outside. He's not allowed indoors. So here we are with a horse and carriage brought up to date for that period. And it wasn't just cars, because this was exactly the same layout that developed for the locomotive. The power, or the horse, the driver, and the passengers way back. It was familiar to us, and that's how it developed. And the train, or the locomotive, of course, some people had ideas that they didn't want to lose that horse at all. And this was a design during the time for a horse-drawn steam locomotive, all in one. So you can see how this horse-drawn vehicle was the mainstay of the way that we developed vehicles. And here we are, see, more horses, more power, the longer the power unit. And that just went on, getting longer. Notice where the driver is. And longer. And eventually to a point where the poor guy, having to drive this, it was sort of almost an impossible position. But then there was a change in technology. And this usually brings a revolution. Well, in this case, it really did. Because all of a sudden, with the diesel locomotive, the driver found himself in front. You could see. But our sense of modernity changed overnight, because this was the latest technology. This is the look of the future back then, 1940s. And that's the way the railway locomotive developed through the Shinkansen train in Japan to a modern-day electric train in China. And you can see how the transition from that poor guy's right at the back of the vehicle, now it looks very much, well, almost like a jet fighter. And this is interesting because this brings into play the aeroplane, which in itself was exactly the same layout as that first motor car and the first locomotive, railway locomotive. Because here's the guy driving it, and here are the horses. Well, of course, the one thing you couldn't do, like with a car or a railway locomotive, is keep making that longer and longer and longer. Otherwise, therefore, it just wouldn't fly. So we got clever. And we split the power onto the wings, and the driver or the pilot started to move forward. And again, our sense of modernity developed with this new layout. This actually is another connection to the automotive world. This is the P-38 Lightning, which Harley Earl, this famous designer at GM, saw and immediately went back to the studio and put the two fins, the tails of the Cadillac. And that developed all the way through. The fins on a car came from that P-38 Lightning. So here's a bit of a mixture, the aeroplane affecting car design. And then, of course, the jet engine and the pilot moving forward, our sense of modernity really developing. So this was very new. Where on the previous, or the original airplanes, the pilot back here, here we're transitioned to completely. And in fact, now that the airplanes are starting to look more natural to our sense of appreciation of form and proportion, that the closer they get to nature, the more we are inherently able to connect it with beauty and good looks and proportion. So here's the cockpit way up forward. I could draw eyes on that, and it would be very much bird-like. And in fact, anybody who ever saw this coming into land would never ever see it as an inanimate object. You couldn't. This was a bird landing, coming into land on the water. So here again, we have this change of perception of modernity, but also connecting to our natural ability or subconscious ability to appreciate nature in mechanical things. Now, the car, go back to the car. This is a famous race car, 1962, I think, Frank?
61 and 64.
Okay, but as you can see, it's again the familiar layout with the long front, the power unit, the driver behind, almost sitting over the rear axle. And this was the sportiest thing that existed. But suddenly, the following year, Ferrari turned up with quite a different looking car, where the horse was no longer in front of the driver, the horse was behind. And this was a complete transition, just like the railway locomotive. Our sense of modernity was shocked overnight into something new. This is the future, as it was then. And that was the way that our imagination went from then on. This mid-engine supercar was the origin of all the concept cars and show cars through the 60s and 70s and beyond. We think that is modern, where the windscreen is way forward. And in fact, again, if you want to think, does the aeroplane have an association with the car, I think it's fairly close in some cases. Where's this all going? Well, not sure. But that actually has been the way that cars, some cars, the small car especially, has been developed. Front-wheel drive, transverse engine makes it possible to bring the upper part of the car forward and creating that look which we feel is the new look, the modernity. However, in some places it stayed the same traditional. The sports sedan here, as in BMW, with a long distance between the front door and the wheel, this is the more traditional horse-drawn vehicle, as it were. And in fact, if you go into the realms of luxury, you can see it even more. Another interesting aspect of this, you note the stance of this car, not like the BMW or the Mercedes, it sits back. The driver is in fact sitting higher behind the horses because he has to see across all of the team of horses. The driver sits higher than the passenger, just as in that horse-drawn carriage. And that's the way real luxury cars have developed, even from here. You can see you have a long front, the driver again outside in the elements, and the owner sitting lower and behind. However, just as an aside, there was one luxury car that didn't really make it. It had limited sales, let's say. But in the Far East, it was quite popular. This is, to me, the wrong way around for a luxury car. The driver should be sitting higher than the passenger. In this case, the owner or the passenger in the rear sitting higher than the driver. Very odd for a luxury car, but in the Far East, it wasn't so, because over there, the servant was always lower than the owner, the master. So funny how that Mercedes or the Maybach was much more of the rickshaw than the horse and carriage. Anyway, moving on to where we're going in the future, with that in mind, we see the early electric cars, it is a hybrid, I know, but this electric car, it still maintains this long distance, the front wheel way out forward and the passenger sitting rearward. And even this car, the Tesla, it's still a sort of transitional period where they're hanging on to the layout, the familiar layout of modern sports luxury cars. And to be honest, this is no different from a V8 engine Maserati when it comes to the proportion here. So Tesla haven't quite made that big step, unlike the newcomers. This is Faraday. If they make it or not, they've made a statement. If you're electric, you don't need space for a V8. And all of the interior can move forward and make much more space in this electric-driven car. We don't need to show the long front of the horse-drawn vehicle anymore. This is more the jet fighter. Same with Lucid. I think this is a very beautiful car and it looks extremely modern. And this is the way that these electric startups have made their clear statement. We're electric, we don't need to be traditional, we'll do something new. And I think, especially this car, where Jaguar, who for how many years now, they've been making long-fronted V12, V8 engine cars with that familiar traditional layout. When they went electric, they threw away their tradition and started again. So this is the way we see the electric power unit having an effect on design and proportion. You don't need that for a big engine, so we don't use it. And in fact, the Volkswagen Group have been showing lots of concepts recently. Even Mercedes-Benz, who again were one of the most traditional sort of designs or proportions, they're starting to show the new way as well. So you can see how this transition is taking place. This is another Mercedes. Now back to the airplane. Have we left them behind? Not at all. This is 1940s, 50s. See, traditional cockpit, windscreen, nose. Nothing changed for 50, 60 years. Sorry. This is a recent Boeing 737, cockpit, flat glass, and a nose in front. But this is the latest Boeing. Now you see the difference, where this single line across the front, which is exactly the same as those trains, exactly the same as those new electric cars. This is our expectation now of a modern look. Even Airbus have done the same thing. Traditional A330, and now the 350. One line running through the front. So we're seeing a transition not just in cars but in aircraft, and in fact, if that was the most modern train around in the 60s, 70s, the Shinkansen, it still had that flat glass windscreen and a nose just like the airplanes, but today this single line, very new, very modern. So this is how we see the transition from traditional ICE engine cars to electric cars. We will no longer have the long front V12 proportion. We will in fact be using that space for something else. Now a lot of people ask me, do we have a future in the car industry? Is there a future of the motor car at all? Well, it's worth thinking about, because for thousands of years this was the only alternative to walking, the horse. And we use the horse for personal transport, carrying goods. A horse-drawn vehicle was everywhere, even beer, even people. The horse-drawn bus was a familiar sight on our roads. Then at the turn of the century, we scrapped the horse. We got rid of it, except one type, the sports model, the racing versions, the leisure model even. No longer the working model or the personal transport model. And the same thing happened with the sailing ship. For thousands of years, the Phoenicians, the Romans, Greeks sailed around the Mediterranean and then the world in sail-driven boats. They developed for hundreds of years, thousands of years, until the turn of the last century, just when the horse began to disappear in favour of the powered vehicle. The sailing ship came to an end, except for one. And we developed this to this day, the sports version, the racing version. So what will happen to our cars? Maybe the only ones we'll see are the ones we watch on a Sunday. Racing, with a driver, or even without. Is this the future of the car? I hope not. We're told that autonomous vehicles will prevail. Well, I'm glad I'm near the end of my career. I've had fun. I wonder how much fun there will be in designing cars in the future, but there's hope. Volvo showed this recently, and it does look a little exciting. But that's where we've come from, and perhaps where we're going. But there is a transition, there is a revolution. By the way, I should have asked you not to take pictures of this presentation. These photographs are for an intern.